We've talked a lot about how important horses were to the early modern English, how they served as a metonymy for leadership and for nation. But guess what? Dogs do as well, and one dog in particular, the English Mastiff. I'm going to show you some evidence that this is true, and I'll start with a passage from Henry V that we have actually talked about.
What it would day.
Alas, poor Harry of England. He longs not for the dawning as we do.
What a wretched and peevish fellow is this King of England to mope with his fat-brained followers so far out of his knowledge.
If the English had any apprehension, they'd run away.
Yet they lag. But if their heads had any intellectual armor, they could never wear such heavy headpieces.
This island of England breeds very valiant creatures. Their Mastiffs are of unnatural courage.
Foolish curs that run winking into the mouth of a Russian bear and have their heads crushed like rotten apples. You may as well say, that's a valiant flea that dare eat his breakfast on the lip of a lion.
Just. And the men are like the Mastiffs. Give them great meals of beef and iron and steel. They'll eat like wolves and fight like dogs.
But these English are shrewdly out of beef.
Then sometime tomorrow they raise their stomachs to eat and none to fight.
Notice, by the way, how the production changes the phrase, the men do sympathize with the Mastiffs, to the men are like the Mastiffs. A simile, right? Like the Mastiffs is a simile. We are prepared at this point, I think, to recognize that there's something else going on in that language. In fact, you ought to recognize it as one of Foucault's system of resemblances. Sympathy is different than simply a metaphor. There's some more intimate connection between the English and their Mastiffs. So it's not just Henry V that does this. In fact, England was famous actually for its dogs. So here's a couple quotations. I'll just read them to you. This one from Fynes Morrison's Itinerary. England hath much more dogs as well for the several kinds as the number of each kind than for any other territory of like compass in the world. So England is somehow special for the number of its dogs. John Lilly says they excel for one thing. They're dogs of all sorts, spaniels, hounds, mastiffs, and divers such. So England was, in the early modern period, famous for dogs in general. And one dog in particular was internationally famous, and that was the English Mastiff. So here's a picture by DeVos of the lion hunt, and you can see there's a dog there, and that dog, who knows what it is in the picture, but we get a hint if we look at William Harrison's description of England. He talks about the English Mastiff. He says, one English Mastiff alone and without any help at all pulled down first a huge bear, and then a pard, that's a leopard, and last of all a lion, each after the other before the French king in one day. So this is an English Mastiff in France demonstrating its prowess by attacking bears and leopards and lions and taking them all down. So let's look a little bit about, how do they describe the English Mastiff? And I'm going to show you something odd here. So here's the Mastiff description from the famous work by Keyes called Of English Dogs, 1576. And the Mastiff or Bandog is vast, huge, stubborn, ugly, eager, of a heavy and burdenous body, therefore but of little swiftness, terrible and frightful to behold. It is a kind of dog capable of courage, violent and valiant, striking cold fear into the hearts of men, but standing in fear of no man, insomuch that no weapons will make him shrink or abridge his boldness. Interestingly, if we look at some of the climate theory of the day, this same language occurs again. This is another work. This is a work of climate theory, The Touchstone of Complexions. Lemnius says, northern people have, quote, gross blood, thick spirits, are seen to be bold and full of virtuous courage, rude, unmannerly, terrible, cruel, fierce. They are not a whit afraid to hazard their bodies in the adventure of any perilous extremity. I have colored in the words that are the same between these two passages just to let you know that the northern peoples, which would include the English, were talked about in the same way that English Mastiffs were talked about. So what we're getting here is a connection between the English Mastiff and the English people, or between dog and nation. Sometimes the English worried about this, or people worried for the English. Here's a passage from a work called Kynegethekon, which comes from the word dog. The English need to be careful lest by continual conversation with dogs they become altogether addicted to slaughter and carnage, which is wholly dishonorable, being a servile employment. So I bold-faced conversation with dogs because this is another kind of connection that should remind you of some of what we've said based on Foucault. This is essentially probably convenience, right? So like conversation with dogs means proximity to continual enjoyment of, if you spend every weekend going and watching the Mastiffs attacking horses and bears and whatnot, that somehow you yourself will become addicted to slaughter and carnage. The English Mastiff was popular not only in general, but with the aristocracy. So there was a fashion of putting dogs in your portraits, and those dogs were often English Mastiffs, although as we'll see, there's a little bit of a change in what the Mastiff looks like. So here are two early pictures. This is Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, and here's a dog given to him by Piers Lee. The Lee family, by the way, is famous for the sort of the origin of the Mastiff story. They were the first people who bred Mastiffs in England. So there's his Mastiff there. Here's another contemporary portrait of Sir Henry Lee and his dog, Beavis. You could see the resemblance between the dogs. That dog, Beavis, also came from the Lee family. But over time, the Mastiff becomes even more heavy in the head, but also a kind of a figure. Here we have, this is a picture by Van Dyck, Thomas Killigrew and his dog. And this is Van Dyck. On the right is Lord Leominster with his Mastiff by Lely, 1685. Van Dyck is earlier than Lely by quite a bit. So here's, the dog in the picture. If you notice anything odd about those two dogs, you notice it's the same dog. So that Lely is simply recycling Van Dyck's dog, and that dog has now become a sort of a, would you like a dog in your portrait? I've got one. It's kind of like the equivalent of photoshopping in the Mastiff, because it becomes associated with kind of aristocratic identity, just as horses did. Think about that. Here, of course, is a famous portrait by Van Dyck of the 5 eldest children of Charles I, with, again, one of these famous English Mastiffs. You could see how big it is there, from 1632. I mentioned the Lee family. Their home is Lime Hall. This is a picture of Lime Hall. If you recognize that picture at all, and you're a fan of Jane Austen movies, you'll know that it's the facade that they used in the most famous version of Pride and Prejudice. It's a beautiful place. That's the back. That's the 18th century editions. The front has a 16th century facade, and there are the remains of the kennels where they bred the dogs. And here's a picture, stained glass picture, from the house itself, depicting the Mastiff of Sir Piers Lee from 1415. And I think if you look back at that little detail from the Robert Dudley picture, you can see that, in fact, the Mastiff is probably changing quite a bit, that it began as a large pointy-nosed dog and ended as a large non-pointy-nosed dog.